of swans slid by, scarcely stirring the water. She sensed them both, watching appreciatively. Back at the house, Abigail was wandering the kitchen in her nightgown, a confection of white cotton she had bought in a vintage clothing shop. Dara remembered her holding up the gown in front of a mirror and claiming that it was waiting to be stained with the blood of a virgin. Now Dara saw that the gown was indeed stained. Brown splotches, probably coffee, patterned one sleeve. "Where were you?" Abigail asked, holding a cafetiere. "I thought you were still in bed." "I went for a walk by the canal. A tall, dark stranger fell at my feet." Dara described the stranger, mentioning her sketching and the house where she had left the man, but not his good looks, nor his taciturnity. "Like Jane Eyre," said Abigail. "Remember how she's sitting on a stile when she hears a horse clattering over the ice and Rochester falls at her feet?" "That's right," said Dara. "He even had a dog like Rochester." I regard the meeting between Jane Eyre and Rochester as one of the most famous in Victorian fiction. Dara is delighted by this coincidence. Perhaps adult readers might think that having Rochester fall at your feet is not an unmitigated blessing, but a rather complicated sort of thing to happen. So you will guess from this that Jane Eyre is Dara's book, and Charlotte Bronte is her author. And I think of Charlotte Bronte as being connected to Dara in several ways, not least her wonderful romantic imagination and her rather tragic life, romantically speaking. She finally married for the first time when she was 39 and died a few months later. So all these great novels were written more out of longing than out of consummation. Sad to say. I want to make sure that there's time for you to ask me questions, if that's something you would like to do. So I'm thinking maybe we should see if there are questions, and then if there's still time, I might read to you a little bit from Abigail's section, and if not, you'll know Abigail's section is coming. But I would be delighted to answer questions if you have any things you'd like to talk about. Yes?
I just had a silly little one. When you were reading about Abigail, she was in the kitchen. She was drinking coffee.
Yes.
And you used a phrase I didn't know what it meant. She picked up her cafe.
A cafetiere. It's what I think it's called various things. Sometimes it's called a French press. It's one of those things you kind of squeeze down for coffee. Mm-hmm. They're quite popular in Britain at the moment.
I know French press. I didn't know.
Yes. Sometimes I debate which term to use and don't use quite the right one, unfortunately. Other questions? Yes.
Who are the other two got now?
Well, John Keats for Sean, Charles Dodgson for Cameron, Dara's father, Charlotte Bronte and Jane Eyre, and Abigail's literary godfather is Charles Dickens, and particularly Charles Dickens in Great Expectations, the wonderful story of a young man who thinks he's not made his fortune, but thinks that great good fortune has befallen him thanks to Miss Havisham, and discovers, of course, that his benefactor is someone quite other than Miss Havisham.
And how does that relate to our character?
Well, in several ways. One is that Charles Dickens was, at the height of his fame, probably the best known author the world had ever known. There are famous photographs of the crowds waiting for him on the docks at New York when he came to give reading tours in New York. He was one of the first writers to give readings, and the crowds were stupendous. I mean, he was a hero. Dickens was very much self-made. He was born into a family where the father was a naval clerk, and the the mother was someone who aspired to a higher level in society, and between the two of them, they spiraled into debt to such an extent that when Dickens was 12, his father was taken into debtor's prison in London, and at that time one of the good things about debtor's prison was that you could bring your family with you, which was actually a plus, because then you had a roof over your head and a certain amount of food. I don't think it was wonderful, but it was better than nothing. So the family all moved into the prison with Charles's father, and Charles Dickens was famously sent to work in this shoe polish factory, and he put the lids on jars of shoe polish. This has become sort of mythologized and dramatized to such an extent that people forget that actually the father did get out of debtor's prison. His mother very reluctantly once more helped out, and Charles did get to go back to school, which he loved, and then when he was 17 became a court reporter, and gradually moved from being a court reporter to being a fiction writer. So not all of these facts, of course, play into my actress character's biography, but the idea of a difficult family background and considerable ambition to reinvent yourself outside the family are both things that are very important to Abigail.
Now, why did you choose all Victorians or all 19th century writers?
You know, why did I choose all Victorian writers? Well, those are I guess it's my book I get to choose. But I wanted to choose very well-known writers who I thought there was a good chance that most readers would have name recognition of. And at one point, I mean, one of the characters says, everybody has a book that's a key to their character, that's a key to their situation. And I think that's a wonderful idea. And certainly it's one I've often believed about myself, though the book keeps changing.
So is this book going to become someone's key?
I would like to think so. That would be extremely nice, yes. But yes, I mean, when I tried to think of how to give the book this idea of literary godparents give it a kind of rationale, it seemed that it was, one way was to choose authors where there was a certain amount of mythology attached, and each of the writers I choose, has certain kind of legends and stories about them over and above their work, and so that was, I think, part of what made them seem so appealing to me. And each of them is an author who used their work to write a kind of coded autobiography. So, for instance, you don't think of Alice in Wonderland as being Charles Dodgson's autobiography, but if you think of that novel, one of the things that happens is Alice falls down the rabbit hole, and then she undergoes all these transformations. She's very big, she's very tall, she can fit under a door, she's swimming. And I think Charles Dodgson passionately wanted a world in which 10-year-old girls could stay 10 forever, and in which the natural laws that kept him from having the kind of relationship he wanted with 10-year-old girls could be subverted, could be overturned. So I think Alice in Wonderland is a very coded autobiography for Charles Dodgson, among other things. Other questions? Yes?
You spoke about the secrets as being the germination for the book. Was there one event or something in your head that brought you to that story? Or were they separate characters that you put together, or was it just, how did it transpire?
Well, I would like to say that there was a wholly rational plan in my head from the moment I wrote the opening sentence, but not so. I started writing with the idea of these three people in this house in London. And I think that one of the things that prompted me to embark on this novel was that I still spend quite a bit of time in London, and for a period of time my next door neighbour was a young man who was working as a ghostwriter, and he was very, very unfortunately ghostwriting a book about suicide, and it was a terrible combination for him, and he was just sort of growing more and more distressed. But something about his situation and the stories he told me about suicide very indirectly crept into this book, and as you will see if you read it. And I think of, I mean, one of my theories about life is that, you know, it's very hard to know why some people manage to escape from childhood difficulties and problems relatively unscathed, and why other people carry that baggage with them all along. You know, and I think there's something very mysterious about that. And, you know, I'm always reading these stories in which, you know, one day someone's living in a log cabin and the next they're president. And I'm thinking, now wait a minute, what happened in between? I mean, I think we're very quick to sometimes analyze people in a way that still doesn't do justice to the psychological complexity of how nature and nurture work together. So that's a rather confused answer. So I started writing about a young man in a house in London who was struggling with writing, and who lived with an actress, a theatre manager, because I had spent quite a lot of time helping in this theatre, and one thing led to another. I also, I should say, had long wanted to write a novel about something that's really important to me, which is about friendship between women. And, you know, friends play a huge part in my life, and yet they're often not seen as nearly as worthy subject matter in fiction as romantic love of various kinds, or crime. And I really wanted to write about what it's like to have a friendship over many years, where there are ups and downs and difficulties and, you know, moments when you come back together. And
do you think Abigail was a good friend to Dara?
Well, I think it was a complicated friendship, but I don't think she was a good friend to Dara, but I don't think Dara was a totally good friend to Abigail either. You know, I think, so I hope that...
I'm not quite done.
So I hope that both of them get their due. Helena.
I don't know how many people have read it, and I don't want to, just if you think this is going to be giving, but Sean and Dara, is there potentially something that could possibly happen there? I mean, maybe that's something I want to see, have seen, I should put it. I mean, you know, they have a couple of, and they seem, even when they're together, he seems somewhat guilty. I don't know, there's an undercurrent.
Yeah. Well, I think that what I'm trying to suggest between Sean and Dara is that she is one of these people, and I have to confess that very often they do seem to be women, who is that wonderful thing, a good listener, and that he does find himself telling her things that perhaps he shouldn't, that he sort of betrays Abigail in the remarks he makes to her best friend, because there's something very almost seductive about how Dara listens, but not seductive, unfortunately, in some sense, towards Dara. And I think one of the things Dara struggles with is that she is the kind of person whom everybody thinks, oh yes, Dara will take in my package from UPS, Dara will babysit, Dara will look after the dog, without thinking, well, wait a minute, what does Dara need? So I try to capture some of that in the novel. But I'm glad you feel there's a certain tension between them, even though that tension isn't acted on in quite the way you might imagine.
And Dara saw herself that way because a couple of times she said that she got the feeling from Abigail that she wasn't as valued, that she thought Abigail didn't think she was on the same level as herself.
And again, I think that's quite a common feeling, that people feel that someone else is privileged or lucky, fortunate, but that person may not actually see it that way. You know, that I think one of my dear friends, her mother said to me once, everyone has a secret sorrow, and I think there's something right about that, but there are people who seem to be kind of blessed and lucky. And the novel talks about some of those ideas about luck and fortune, how we think we go through life making decisions, but actually all kinds of things in our lives are changed by chance or fortune. And I think that's very, I mean, I think that can be wonderful and it can be terrible, but it's certainly confusing. Other questions?